We had countless fiery clashes as Chancellor and Shadow Chancellor, but in recent years there's been a coalition of sorts between myself and George Osborne on ITV Night for the elections on the Andrew Neil Show.
Yes, George has even described Ed as his frenemy. And they have a new podcast which launches tomorrow. Does it mark the end of this bitter political divide? We're going to speak to George Osborne in just a moment. First, though, here's a reminder of their time at the dispatch box when the gloves were off in the House of Commons.
They were.
George Osborne joins us now. Very good morning to you. There will be people who think, and it's really a question to both of you, actually, you are known as the austerity chancellor. You might not like that, or you may be proud of it. I don't know. Which one?
Well, I'm proud of the decisions we took to try and fix the economy, which included being tough on public spending.
Yes, public spending, which led to cuts for all sorts of people, including, you know, those who are the poorest, of course. That's the concern, is that you were particularly tough on those who were in receipt of benefits, things like the two-child policy, the bedroom tax, that you really sort of took a scythe to public spending. And with that in mind, there are people watching who would think, for you, how on earth can you get over that politically to have an alliance, a coalition? So, well, George, first you.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would still defend the decisions we took then.
Of course you would.
Because the country had no money. You remember the famous letter, "There's no money left," which is what greeted us when we arrived in the Treasury. And we took difficult decisions. But that period of British history, now some years ago, you know, was one where the British economy stabilised, jobs were created. And I would say the poorest in society saw actually their incomes start to rise and weren't put on the unemployment rolls as they were in other countries after the financial crash. But obviously the decisions were difficult because if you try and tell people, as you know, you'll find today with politicians, there's no money left and we have to make tough decisions about what you want to spend the money on, or we're going to have to increase taxes and people don't want to pay more in tax. You know, if you confront people with those choices, they're often, I wouldn't say they're unpopular, because what I'd say, Susanna, is at the end of this period where we confronted the nation with those choices, they re-elected us. You know, when they got the chance to say, do we want to have this lot again, they said yes.
In the 2015 election.
So I think politicians today are too nervous, maybe we'll come on and talk about this, on the, you know, of telling people, you know what, triple lock on pensions or benefits going up by 8%, we can't afford it this year. And I think you get more credit than the politicians reckon with the public, and people are listening to this programme, they are not stupid, they perfectly well understand that things have to be paid for and taxes are already very high. And so back then, I think we got credit for telling people the truth.
So a couple of the things which you were criticised for, objective medical assessment for the disability living allowance, various reforms to housing benefit, tax credits, freezing rates of child benefit, a 2-year pay freeze for public sector workers, housing benefit reduced, income level for family tax credits changed, and some people would say long-term impact, for instance, on the NHS, schools. We've just had the concrete ceiling crisis, which is now ongoing, blamed on your austerity budget. Well, are there ever moments where you look back and go, I just cut people to the quick?
No, because, look, I'm not saying we got everything right, but, you know, faced with a financial crash, it was the biggest crash in our lifetimes, right? And it affected countries all over the world. And those countries that had a clear plan, like Britain at the time, under the David Cameron government, did do better. We recovered, the economy grew, people were in work. More jobs were created under the Cameron government than any British government in history. And all that, you know, when I was a child, unemployment was the big issue. It was not an issue despite the massive crash. And that's because we had a plan. And some of those decisions we took were controversial, of course. But you can't say, I'm going to cut spending, I'm going to make sure the state doesn't borrow too much, and then say, but I'm not going to touch benefits, and I'm not going to touch public services, and I'm not going to touch... You can't do it, because that's what public spending...
You don't think that the gap between the rich and the poor became bigger? That those with the broadest shoulders didn't do what they could have done to help?
The decisions that generated the most noise when I was in TV studios like this back then were things like taking child benefit away from the richest people, the top 15% of the country. Now, they wouldn't regard themselves as rich, and some of them are on incomes, you know, where they're still struggling to get through. But those were the really controversial decisions. University fees, that was the thing that created a big riot, even though people who go to university end up getting much better jobs often than people who don't. And I think at the time, we can talk about this on our podcast, Ed and I became a little bit cynical about political coverage on this family and in this country. And I thought that a lot of the noise I got was mostly directed against things I took away from the middle classes. And I couldn't help but notice that most of the people writing the newspapers and presenting the news and putting together TV shows...
You think it was about self-interest?
There was just a touch, not of self-interest, but of not understanding that there were other issues out there, and people always do focus on the things that affect them most.
I would say on this programme, we focus on the things which affect our audience, our viewers most, on whatever income.
But I never got, you know, I'm not going to pick on this show because I actually had lots of good experiences on this show, but you know, its previous form. But I remember I used to say to the BBC, you have asked me more questions on interviews on all sorts of your programmes about taking child benefit away from the top 15% of the country than about freezing tax credits for the bottom 15%. And I think that's... And you are more focused on asking students to pay more money, even though students tend to come from better off sections of society, than you are about some of the difficult decisions we've had to take for lower income people. And I guess it's an interesting... Now, again, I've been out of politics for many years now, but I kind of reflect on how that coverage... was at the time.
Well, you say that. I couldn't possibly comment because I don't know what coverage you're referring to. I would defend journalists in their efforts to scrutinise what you did.
I've been a newspaper editor, and I do absolutely defend the journalists I work with. I'm just saying that, you know, if you put yourself in the shoes of the job that I did as Chancellor, or, you know, Ed was in the Treasury as well, you have a very straightforward choice, which is, yes, you can spend more money in the NHS, you can spend more money on pensions, you can spend more money on the army, more money on the police. The money has to come from somewhere.
Of course.
And it's not going to come from billionaire oligarchs, which is always the answer. It's going to come from working people. That's how you pay for the large amount of public services we have in this country. And then when someone suggests paying more tax, Rishi Sunak last year said, I want to increase people's national insurance, and the Labour politicians and the Conservative politicians who didn't support him came on with shows like this and said we shouldn't be paying more tax. And then you're stuck in the Treasury with that political...
It disproportionately affects those who are at the lower end of earnings.
It's a political reality. We are in the one-year anniversary of the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng budget. And that was a budget where the sums didn't add up, where they said, you know what, we're going to borrow this money. We're going to spend more. We're not going to ask you to pay more tax. In fact, we're going to cut your taxes, and we're going to borrow more. And it was an economic disaster.
Complete disaster.
Well, there's the connection then. OK, so you are united, both of you, opposite sides of the political divide. But when it came to what ended up being called the kamikaze budget, you are united that was a disaster.
But those are the lessons you learn. The only things which last in a society are the things which become agreed upon. So, Bank of England independence, the national minimum wage. The Conservatives opposed it in 1997. George ended up boasting about raising the national minimum wage. And both of us look at what Liz Truss did around Bank of England, or the way she went about ditching the Office of Budget Responsibility for budget making. It was a disaster. The thing is, there's things which we disagreed on and still do strongly. I disagree strongly with abolishing Sure Start or cancelling building schools for the future. Interestingly, so does Michael Gove now. He looks back. Hopefully, George and I have got the ability to look back and talk about what we got right and what we got wrong.
Triple lock.
Learning from those things which allow us to then talk about the future.
Triple lock on pensions. You brought that in. There are now murmurs that perhaps money could be saved by suspending it, ditching it. What would you say to the government?
So, first of all, it was introduced because pensioner poverty was a big issue 13, 14 years ago. And we had marches of pensioners demanding more generous pensions. And none of that is now a big issue in British politics. Pensioner poverty, I'm not saying that pensioners have a lot of money, but that kind of issue of acute poverty for pensioners has been in part solved by the triple lock. Now, but of course, it was introduced in a time where you were not having inflation at 8-9% or wage growth at 8-9%. If I was the Chancellor today, I would be very tempted to underrate, i.e. not increase pensions by as much as the triple lock and other benefits, working age benefits that go to other people in society, by maybe like 1 or 2%. It generates, it saves a lot of money for the Treasury at a time when things are really tight. You could put some more money into public services. If you wanted to cut taxes, you could do it, or certainly avoid tax rises, which otherwise are coming. So it's quite an obvious sort of target there for the Treasury. I'm sure they're thinking about it a lot. There is a precedent. It was done once during the pandemic. And, we're also on Political Currency, our podcast, we're going to be explaining the political thinking behind some of these decisions. The Tories will know it's a real pain for Labour to work out what to do if the government announces it. Do they promise to spend more money, in which case all the voters are going to go, uh-oh, you vote Labour and your taxes are going to go up? Or they stick with the government's plan, in which case...
Who are they?
What's the point of them, right?
Interesting thing, though, George, your former economic advisor, Rupert Harris, and now a Conservative candidate, he's gone a bit further. He was saying yesterday on Twitter that we should consider having a review of the whole support for pensions as a way of maybe moving away long-term from the triple lock. Mel Strider said in the long term it's unsustainable. In the end, is Rupert Harris, and he's going to be the politician next time rather than you. Is he right to say this should be up for grabs?
I don't want to, finish off his career before it started, but Rupert Harris is definitely someone to watch in British politics. And he's doing the classic thing, which is, I was mentioning student fees. Peter Mandelson came to me when I was Shadow Chancellor and said, we want to put up student fees. It's too controversial for a Labour government. Why don't we set up a review that's going to recommend to whoever forms the next government that they should go up? And I can imagine on pensions, you could try and get some kind of cross-body thing. It's tough because pensioners vote. They're a very, very important part of the electorate. And the political parties will be competing for their support. So they'll be nervous of disarming ahead of a general election.
2 quick questions before we let you go. You're the boss at the British Museum. Have you found the 2,000 items yet?
Well, we found over 300.
Where?
From people who bought them, they thought, legitimately and have offered to return them.
Quite a lot more to find, then?
Still quite a lot more to find. I mean, these thefts have gone on for, we think, almost 20 years. It's obviously a very sad episode for the museum, but we're doing everything we can to learn the lessons. We're doing everything we can to recover the stolen items. It looks like an inside job, but the police are investigating, so I can't say too much about that. If you went to the museum today, like literally today, you'd still see it packed with people enjoying our exhibitions and shows. It's one of the most visited places in Britain, and let's learn the lessons of what went wrong, but make it still that great place that people want to take their families to.
And you got married recently, congratulations. Did you ever find out who staged the protest where you were confettied with orange paper? And we all assumed it was Just Stop Oil because they endorsed it. They denied it was them. Did you get an explanation?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that I hadn't, both Thea and I had no idea it was a protester. So we come out, someone throws some confetti, it's all very nice. And about 4 or 5 hours later at the reception, someone said, that was a protest. We're like, really? Because the woman had run up and said, congratulations, and thrown this orange confetti at us. So we didn't know it was a protest at the time. It was only, I know basically as much as anyone else, which is, it was a sort of rogue element of Just Stop Oil. It was a freelance Just Stop Oil person who was, I think, kind of involved in the local council in some way, and Just Stop Oil disowned her. So it was a protest too far for Just Stop Oil. But it didn't ruin the wedding, as Ed will attest, because he was there.
And you can hear more of this unusual political alliance on Political Currency, the podcast, which launches tomorrow. George Osborne, thank you very much indeed. Ed Walls, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Susanna, for allowing me to ask a question.